prayers. Jake Magruder, for continued health improvement. Mavis Hale is Lila Long's mother, and she's at Story Point. So you can do a twofer. You can go by and see Nancy, and you can get Mavis at the same time. Let's see, Rebecca Smith, she's having some pain issues. Even though she had back surgery, it's still not great. Let's keep let's keep in our prayers the Douthit family as they're traveling. So they're kind of on a sabbatical for the next several months, and let's just keep encouraging.
My daughter Amberly is due actually August, but they're taking the baby early on the 30th. I'm leaving on the 23rd to go down. This is an extremely high risk pregnancy, and her delivery is going to be very dangerous. So they're going to start thinking about taking him maybe on the 29th if there's no signs, which there's not. All of her babies have been very late, so they're going to probably put her in early and start some medication and start getting things in that process. But they're inducing her like there'll be a baby on the 30th, or provided things go well. But it's called umbilical vein varix, and it could lead to blood clots, stillbirth. It's extremely dangerous. So prayers are appreciated.
Absolutely. Absolutely. For Carrie and Cindy and Amberly.
And baby Wesley.
Oh, Wesley, I like that. All right, well, y'all, let's go to our classes, and love y'all. Let's have a great day. Let's worship our God. See that big old machine out there?
That's my mom's phone.
That's my company, man. We're going to be cutting all these orange squares. We're cutting all those around tomorrow. Patching those and then painting the whole one.
Just wanted to
My best friend owned this company and started it.
If I do what? I know, I just do. I'll look it up. No, it was like, what am I doing?
Oh yeah. Guard your words when you go to the house of the Lord. Yeah, let your words be few. Yes, it was fun. Yeah, it was good. Just family time, cousin time, lots of playing.
How was the weather?
Hotter than here. Yeah. forgot.
I'm supposed to be helping.
Oh. Thank you. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. No, you're fine. You're fine. We're going to be in the book of Micah today. Micah. We're going to do chapters 1 through 3 and maybe chapter 4, as well as some introductory stuff. So let's go ahead and bow in a word of prayer. Let's pray. God, I thank you very much for your love and your grace and your kindness. You are such a loving Heavenly Father. We thank you that we get to be together as a church family and that we get to come together for our Bible study time. We're thankful for the word and the message of the prophet Micah and the incredible work that he did in your name. We do pray that as we consider very carefully the lessons from his work of prophecy, that we would put those lessons into practice and that we would really consider very carefully how our lives also need to be molded and shaped in the same way that Micah's contemporaries did. We thank you very, very much for your Son, Jesus Christ, and his work of grace and sacrifice. We pray that we would never take it for granted that he died on that cross for our sins and was raised from the grave for our hope of the resurrection. We pray this in his name. Amen. All right, so here we are in Micah. Micah is where we get our name, Michael. Who is like the Lord? Who is like the Lord? Let's talk a little bit about Micah and his background. He says of himself at the beginning of the book that he is from Moresheth, Gath. That's a borderland between Judah and Philistine territory. And I'll show you a map in just a sec to give you some idea of where that is. Although Moresheth Gath is not precisely known, there's no archaeological site that I think has been precisely identified with it. We do know roughly where it is, but it was between Judah and Philistine territory. Now it's very different from Tekoa, where Amos was from. Amos is about 17 miles to the east in Tekoa. Tekoa is a very rocky, much more dry, arid place, whereas over here, this is an area called the Shephelah. Shephelah is a wide open grassland, beautiful, green, lush area. And so very, very different. You know, Amos is and I think that kind of provides some contrast in the tone that Micah and Amos each take as well. Amos is very stark, very to the point, very blunt. Micah is much more poetic, although Amos is certainly a beautiful book. I don't mean to intimate that it's not poetic, but Micah is a much more poetic book. And Micah also has more of a rhythm and a flow to it. It's definitely a more artistic presentation than Isaiah's book tends to be. And you'll kind of see that flow a little bit where he comes in, yes, with judgments and condemnation, but the judgments and condemnation, like waves going against the seashore, abate. And then there's these little poems that he offers about hope and restoration. But then he comes back in with condemnation and judgment, and then hope and restoration, condemnation and judgment. And then he finally ends the book with hope and restoration. So it's a very artistic, flowing book that he's put together. His ministry is dated to 735 to 700 BC, give or take, and he clearly identifies his ministry with the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Jotham is a good king, though not extraordinarily good. Jotham is considered a good king. The thing that is said of Jotham is that he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, but he did not take away high places. He did not eliminate idolatry. So Jotham was personally faithful to God and did what was right in God's eyes, but he did not seem to exert enough influence over Judah as a whole to get anybody else to eliminate idolatry from their life. That maybe is a bit of an overstatement, but that's kind of the takeaway from Jotham. How about Ahaz? What was Ahaz like? Very bad. Very bad. Ahaz, under every green tree and on every hill and on the top of every mountain and in every place that he could erect an altar to sacrifice to the idols, he was doing it. Instead of turning to the Lord, he hired Assyria to help him out when there was an alliance of Israel and Syria against him. He paid Assyria to come and help him. And in turn, Assyria came back and actually harmed him. They took the money and helped him, and then also hurt him at the same time, because that's the kind of friend Assyria is. When he was up, I believe it was in Damascus, where he saw an altar, he just thought, oh, this is the greatest thing ever. Get the plans for this. Ooh, I'll build something like this back home. And he took the plans for this idolatrous pagan altar and had it replicated back home because he just thought that altar was so great. And to top it all off, he was triple B, baby burning bad. He was a king who did offer his sons as sacrifices. It says that he offered them as burnt sacrifices. He put them over the fire and offered them. And so he was really, 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 really bad. Hezekiah. What about Hezekiah? What do we make of Hezekiah?
One of the best.
Yeah, one of the best. Yeah, he's top tier. He's tier one of the extraordinarily good kings, both personally and in the influence that he exerted over his country. Because you had good kings like Jotham who don't seem to, for as good as he was, he just didn't seem to have the influence over the rest of the country. Hezekiah, he was both personally very faithful and also extraordinarily successful as a king over his people. The only knock on Hezekiah from his life is maybe, you could say that he was probably a little bit, I don't know. When the Babylonians came, what do you say of that?
He put himself on the Babylonians to be conquered.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yes, that's a good way. Yeah, for all of his faithfulness, when the Babylonians came and took a tour of Jerusalem, Hezekiah was more than excited to show them his treasures and his wealth. And the Babylonians probably, like John said, they went ahead and earmarked him for conquering later on.
It's interesting to see that bad fathers have good sons and good fathers have bad sons.
Yeah.
I attribute it to their mothers.
Well,
a good mother can overcome a bad father.
All joking aside, I think the fact that the history of the kings of Judah and Israel consistently point out who the mothers were as well, so-and-so became king of Judah, and he reigned for this many years, and his mother's name was. The fact that the writers chronicle and, actually tell who the mothers are, maybe it's just incidental information, record keeping. Could just be record keeping. But it could also be an indication that John is onto something, that mothers do have a huge influence over their children. And that you might have a really, really good king, a good father, who marries because of political alliance or economic alliance or whatever it might be, and he ends up having a rascal as a son because of the influence of the person that he chose to marry. And then the opposite could also be true, that a really bad king, maybe because of the good influence of his wife, one of his many wives perhaps in a harem, has great influence over her son, and this son ends up becoming a strong and faithful ruler. There's joking aside, there's probably something to that idea. And this is where Micah fits in here, so you can kind of see who he's contemporary with. He's contemporary. You got Micah right here in blue. So you got Joel, the tail end of Hosea, maybe a little bit of Nahum there. And it's also believed that he was probably also with Isaiah. Yeah, there's Isaiah there, the cream colored Isaiah. And incidentally, there are actually places in Micah that overlap the book of Isaiah almost word for word. If you take Micah chapter 4, for example, if you just start reading through Micah chapter 4, it talks about the mountain of the house of the Lord being established, raised above the hills, the peoples will stream to it. Many nations come and say, come, let us go to the mountain of the house of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways. Does that sound word for word like Isaiah chapter 2? It should, because it's word for word Isaiah chapter 2. Now, whether Micah was copying Isaiah or Isaiah was copying Micah, I don't think it's a matter of copying as much as it is Isaiah and Micah were both prophesying to the same group of people at the same time with the same problems, and these are God's people, right? This is, Micah is a faithful prophet of God. Isaiah is a faithful prophet of God. You don't think at some point they met each other. You don't think at some point they consulted with each other. You don't think at some point they said, hey, I'm prophesying to kind of this community over here, and Isaiah, you're in the king's palace. You're there in Hezekiah's chambers, right? Able to prophesy to him. I find it interesting that Micah was not like the prophet of the king's palace, but Isaiah was, and yet they have the exact same message. I mean, word for word, the exact same message about the messianic expectation, about the mountain of the house of the Lord being established as the chief mountain. And that is absolutely richly messianic in its tone. It also gives you a sense of where we are in history. By the time you get to Hezekiah, what's happened to Israel? Yeah, they're gone. Assyrian captivity. So gone are the days of Jeroboam II. Okay, we spent a lot of time there, admittedly, a lot of time talking about Jeroboam II during the time of Jonah and Amos, and these were times that needed to be dealt with. But gone are those days, the halcyon days of Jeroboam II and Uzziah, and now we've come into the times of trouble where it's Assyria on the horizon, it's Babylon on the horizon. It is, you've got to be faithful to God because you are on really, really icy ground right now, very, very thin ice with God. And you can see that, what the results were of that. His life and his work certainly covered an eventful period, to be sure. There was up and down spiritual condition in Judah. From Jotham, a pretty good king who didn't influence his country very well, to a horrible king in Ahaz who burned babies on altars, to an extraordinarily good king in Hezekiah. That's some really, really hardcore pendulum swinging right there. The capture of Israel by the Assyrians and the end of the northern kingdom, and the deliverance also. So he would have probably lived through the deliverance of Judah from the Assyrians during Hezekiah's reign. You remember the Assyrians were coming, they were looming, the Lachish relief made by Sennacherib, and Lachish is even mentioned actually, which is really interesting. We'll talk about that. Lachish is mentioned in chapter 1 and verse 13. But Lachish was one of the cities that was destroyed by the Assyrians in the lead up to the confrontation at Jerusalem, right at the very gates of Jerusalem. So, Micah saw a lot of things in his life. That's a really, really eventful period of history that he was working in as a prophet. Any other kind of big picture stuff, historical things, background stuff that you want to look at before we move on? Okay. So features of the book, what we're going to notice here. Micah immediately appears to be what you might call the prophet of the poor and the downtrodden. Very similar to Amos, he talks a lot about injustice and abuse, taking advantage of poor people. That seems to be a really, really major theme in his book. One writer said of Micah, he had Amos's passion for justice and Hosea's heart for love. I thought that was a really, really good summation of it. But he always attributes his boldness to God. I think, without necessarily calling this the thesis statement of the book, I do think one of the key passages in Micah is Micah 3, verse 8, where he says, "On the other hand, I am filled with power, with the Spirit of the Lord, and with justice and courage to make known to Jacob his rebellious acts, even to Israel his sin." And I love that idea of that I am filled with power, but he always attributes it with the Spirit of the Lord. It is my enthusiasm, My verb, it comes from the Spirit of God being upon me. It is always to God's glory and to God's credit. And I think it's a really, really cool passage that encapsulates Micah's attitude toward his prophesying. He seems to be a simple person, probably a countryman of humble origins. Nothing is known of his occupation or of his family. And the tone of the book reflects the age. It was an age of affluence, but it was indifferent to sound religion. Jotham was a good king who nevertheless didn't deal with idolatry. Ahaz went all in and led the people to a time of deep spiritual and moral defilement. Okay, rampant corruption. That seems to be, going back to the previous slide, that seems to be kind of one of the main themes that we'll see here is the rampant corruption that seems to flow throughout the book, chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Woe to those who scheme iniquity, who work out evil on their beds. When morning comes, they do it. It is in the power of their hands. He talks about robbing the poor in chapter 2 and verse 8. Women being cast out. These are women in need, right? You know, women who are thrown out, widows who are being thrown out of their homes and their property in 2 verse 9. Corrupt business practices in chapter 6 verse 11. Powerful false prophets in chapter 2 verse 11. Who work for money and prophesy for money in chapter 3 verse 6. Rulers are compared to cannibals in chapter 3 verses 1 through 3, which hopefully we'll look at here later in this lesson. Judges taking bribes in chapter 7 verse 3, and following after the statutes of wicked rulers like Omri and Ahab, rulers, by the way, who were long gone, long since dead, and yet the rules that they made, the laws that they enacted, still seem to have an influence over both Israel and Judah, chapter 6 and verse 16. So let's go ahead and get to the text now. Anything else? Just any other big picture introductory stuff before we read some text now? Okay, let's jump in. Can I get a volunteer to read verses 1 through 7 of chapter 1? 1 through 7.
The word of the Lord that came to Micah of Moshe in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, which he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. Hear, you peoples, all of you, pay attention, O earth and all that is in it, and let the Lord God be a witness against you, the Lord from his holy temple. For behold, the Lord is coming out of this place, and will come down and tread upon the high places of the earth. And the mountains will melt under him, and the valleys will split open like wax before the fire, like waters poured down a steep place. All this is for the transgression of Jacob, and for the sins of the house of Israel. What is the transgression of Jacob? Is it not Samaria? And what is the high place of Judah? Is it not Jerusalem? Therefore I will make Samaria a heap in the open country, a place for planting vineyards, and I will pour down her stones into the valley, and uncover her foundations.
And verse 7 also.
All her carved images shall be beaten to pieces, all her wages shall be burned with fire, and all her idols I will lay waste. For from the fee of a prostitute she gathered them, and to the fee of a prostitute they shall return.
He's a really good writer. Micah is a really good writer. And of course, it's all from the Spirit of the Lord, but in a tone that is uniquely and individually Micah. Man, these are powerful passages. So he talks about Samaria and Jerusalem. What's the significance of both of those cities? Why these two cities? Why does he mention these two cities? Yeah, they're the capitals. Yeah, that's right. They're the two kingdoms, northern and southern, right? Israel and Judah. Samaria is the capital of the northern kingdom. Its foundations were laid, and it was glorified and built up into a really powerful city by Ahab, and Jerusalem being the historic capital of the southern kingdom of Judah. And I think such a powerful idea there is in verse 5, like, what's the centerpiece of your idolatry? What's the source of all this false religion? What is the thing that is tripping you up the most? It's your own cities, your own capital cities. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that Micah is anti-city, or that the tone of this book is meant to be anti-city. But one thing that you will notice, and as you read through the whole book, there is an undeniable tone that he takes with city dwelling and city living. Just as a purely practical application, what is it about living in a city? Just any city, modern city, whatever. What is it about living in a city? What are some of the dangers spiritually of living in a city? And maybe you can go, Go all the way back to the Tower of Babel, right? The book of Genesis. Like, what's the danger of living in a city?
You have all the influences around you for one.
Okay, so it's abundant influences. It's a higher population, which means higher likelihood of bad influences around you. So you get a lot of influence. What else? Self-sufficiency, right? It's typically in a city, you've got a marketplace, which means you're not growing your own food, you're not hunting for your own food, you're not baking your own bread. You just go to the market, you go to the store, you get what you need. So there's this idea of we can do this, right? We have the bakeries, we have the blacksmith, we have the shops, we have the peddlers. So there's this idea of like self-contained self-sufficiency. And that you're not relying on God, you're not relying on the land, you're not relying on the harvest. You're just there in the city, and it's much more of a closed environment. And as for the environment, who makes that environment? Does God make the environment of a city, or does man make the environment of a city? Now, I guess, remember, God makes all things. We understand that. God makes the resources. So I think you understand what I mean, but who makes that environment? Man does. Yeah, that is a human environment. It's a crafted, curated, carefully cultured human environment where you look at the works of man's hands. Look at the building that I've made. Look at the monument that I've made. Look at the temple, the altar, the whatever it happens to be. Remember back in Matthew chapter 23 and 24, how the disciples were basically taking Jesus on a tour of Jerusalem, and they were pointing out all the buildings and the temple over there. And how does Jesus respond in Matthew 24? He says, not a single stone will be left on top of another that you see before your eyes. Is Jesus impressed with Jerusalem? No, not that much. Nope, not that much.
Not with the buildings.
Not with the buildings. Yeah, not with the buildings. Not with all the stuff Herod built. And did Herod build some nice buildings? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Herod built a lot of nice stuff. It's a nice city. Jesus was unimpressed. So again, I'm not saying that Micah is decidedly anti-city, but he clearly comes across as someone who identifies that when you live in Samaria, when you live in Jerusalem, later on he mentions Lachish in verse 13. He mentions Meroth in verse 12. He talks in verses 10 and 11 about these cities, and he actually uses these cities as like a play on words in verses 11 and 12 about all these different cities. He clearly has kind of an anti-city agenda simply because of the danger spiritually that cities represent. So that's really a very fascinating element.
This was also the location of the kings and the priests and many times the prophets. So the leaders were there too.
Yeah.
But they did not lead in good ways. So
yeah.
He's going to say a lot about those too.
Yeah, that's a good point also. So if you're going to identify, if the problem is princes and kings and prophets and priests, you're going to find most of them in Jerusalem and Samaria. Anyway, that's kind of the seat of that kind of earthly authority that they have. God comes down, like that's always a powerful image, is when God comes down. What happens to the mountains when God steps out from heaven and starts walking on the earth? What do the mountains look like? Melted wax. Melted wax. Everything melts before God. And that's the idea of the day of the Lord imagery that we see in so many of these prophets, is that the day of the Lord, and I know he doesn't use the term the day of the Lord here in this context, but this day of the Lord imagery is always your world being turned upside down. That the mountains that we think of as so permanent, I mean, the mountains were here long before us and they'll be here long after us. I remember, as a kid growing up out west, we lived very close to a lot of mountains, the Cascade Mountains, the Coast Range there in Oregon. You can see Mount Hood, 11,000 foot Mount Hood. Rebecca and I have climbed to the top of the tallest mountain in Arizona, over 12,000 feet. Mountains are so permanent. And yet, when God's pinky toe makes contact with the mountains, what happens to them? They just melt like wax. Let's keep going here in the chapter. Let's not get bogged down too much. So like I said, in 8 through 16, he's going to mention a bunch of cities here and talk about their names as kind of a play on words. He mentions Gath in verse 9 or verse 10. He mentions Beth La'athra, which means house of dust. He talks about Shaphir in verse 11, which means pleasantness, but he calls it shameful nakedness. In verse 11, the inhabitant of Zaanann does not escape, and yet Zaanann means going out. So the city that's called going out, he says, you ain't going to go out anymore. There will be no escaping Zaanann. That easel in verse 11 will have a lamentation, and it is called house of removal, and he says he will take from you its support. In verse 12, Meroth means bitterness. He says the inhabitant of Meroth becomes weak, waiting for any good. Calamity only comes. He mentions Lachish in verse 13, which I think is important to point out that Lachish, there is and we've talked about it before, but in the British Museum there's a massive thing called the Lachish Relief, and it covers several walls. I mean, like from here to there, like the whole wall is the Lachish Relief. Several large walls in the British Museum, and it depicts the invasion of the Assyrians into Judah and the destruction of the city of Lachish, which was a Judean city. And it's those scenes that I've showed you before, which we don't need to dwell upon too much because it's just super uncomfortable. People being skinned and flayed and put on pikes and heads piled up, and people being taken away into slavery and prostrating themselves before the great king Sennacherib. But he mentions Lachish.
It was a heavily fortified Judean city.
Yes, it was. It was an important city. That's why he attacked Lachish, because defeating Lachish was part of defeating the overall defensive system that was built in Judah. So I think it's interesting here how Lachish is mentioned there. So you just have these series of cities that get mentioned, and it cleverly, again, the play on words with each of them, pointing out their doom. Let's go to chapter 2 then. Let's read verses 1 through 5. Can somebody read 1 through 5 for me of chapter 2?
I can do it.
Go ahead, Heather. Thank you.
Woe to those who scheme iniquity, who work out evil on their beds. When the morning comes, they do it. It is in the power of their hands. They covet fields and seize them, and houses and take them away. They rob a man in his house, a man in his inheritance. Therefore, thus says the Lord, behold, I am planning against this family a calamity, which you cannot remove from your necks, and you will not walk haughtily or proudly, and for it will be an evil time. On that day they will take up against you taunts and utter a bitter lamentation and say, we are completely destroyed. He exchanges the portion of my people, how he removes it from me. To the apostles he appoints us at our fields. Therefore you will have no one stretching a measuring line, for by lots in the assembly of the Lord.
Yeah.
So what God is saying is that, while you've been doing all this out, you scheme, work out evil on your beds, you're taking advantage of it before. I've been watching all this time.
Yeah.
I'm not blind. I'm not ignorant. I know what's going on. And it is true, how you treat the people around you, even though the poor are probably not, on a spiritual sense, any more righteous, than the rich are. It's still wrong.
Yeah.
And there is a consequence from it.
And look at verses 1 and 3 in particular. Woe to those who scheme iniquity and work out evil on their beds. And then look at God's response in verse 3. Behold, I am making plans. Like you're making all these plans, you're scheming iniquity and working evil out in your bed, and God's response is, listen, I'm making plans too. While you're scheming iniquity, I'm also making plans, and I'm planning calamity upon you.
And all this wealth that they've lusted for, they've coveted, they've accumulated it, it's all going to disappear. And when he says, there will be no haughtiness, all of the pride is going to disappear. Just like what Amos tried to tell them. The Virgin of Israel has fallen, she will rise no more.
Yeah.
And, that it's truly a tragedy that it's come to this, and like you said, it was horrific.
Yeah.
As it was.
Yeah.
That, you know, God has, you know, He's proven over and over. I said, I've done nothing to you. I said that you, I said, would treat. I said, me, I said, this way, that you, I said, would not regard me, I said, as holy. And He can't just, I said, you know, allow it to continue. At some point, you know, the consequence, I said, is coming.
Yeah. Yeah, and listen, and the way he points it out is that your record is clear. Your record speaks against you. You sit up at night thinking like, oh, tomorrow, okay, we were able to kick 3 widows out of their homes yesterday. Oh, that was great, man. I just get so excited every time we kick a widow out of her house. And there's that one, oh, she managed to pay her rent this month. Oh, we could raise her rent. Yes, we'll raise her rent now. Ha ha! And they stay up at night scheming ways that they might be able to hurt people, harm people, take advantage of people. And I love this image of your record speaks out against you. You know what you've done. So don't be shocked and don't be surprised when horrible things happen to you. Don't be surprised because you did horrible things. And also, I love in verse 5 also, therefore you have no one stretching a measuring line for you by lot in the assembly of the Lord. It's like, you're going to have no advocates. There's going to be nobody speaking up for you. When people look at what happens to you, well, you got what you deserved. You got what you deserved. There's nobody speaking up for you anymore. Do not speak out in verse 6, so they speak out. I love that. I was like, they're such obstinate people, stubborn people. And as a parent, you can't help but just identify a little bit with God when you say, do not speak out, so they speak out. You know, when you're trying to sit your kids down and explain what they've done wrong and how they could have done it better, and you're trying to talk to your kids, and you say, listen, I need you to sit and listen for a second. Yeah, but Dad, no, don't talk. I need you to listen to me. Yeah, but don't speak out, so they speak out. And it's very, very funny there, the way it's said. I forgot to mention, verse 7, going back to chapter 1. I meant to point this out. I know I'm going to run out of time now because I can't help myself. But I find verse 7 to be a very fascinating passage that I just want to point it up just so you can highlight in your Bible. The second half of it, for she collected them from a harlot's earnings, and to the earnings of a harlot they will return. That to me is, in like modern language, easy come, easy go. Like I feel like that's what he's saying there is easy come, easy go.
Well, they're going to take everything from them.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was
going to be left desolate.
It was harlot's earnings. You earned it as a harlot, you'll lose it as a harlot. Okay, so here in chapter 2, as we move through to verses 12 and 13, this is one of the first of these several striking promises of restoration and hope that I mentioned. The flow of this book, again, it is condemnation, 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 restoration and hope. Condemnation, restoration and hope. Like just kind of this ebb and flow. And I think it's a really, really beautiful thing that he's talked about harlot's wages and trouble coming upon you and planning calamity and planning iniquity. And then he gets to verses 12 and 13. And the tone changes. I will surely assemble all of you, Jacob. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. I will put them together like sheep in the sheepfold, like a flock in the midst of its pasture. A restoration of Psalm 23, fulfilled in Jesus in John 10. Jesus talks about being the great shepherd, and Jesus is the sheepfold, the door into the sheepfold. They will be noisy with men. Verse 13, the breaker goes up before them. They break out, pass through the gate, and go out by it. So their king goes on before them, and the Lord at their head. It's a very beautiful thing, and it harkens back to the imagery of Psalm 23. And the Lord being our shepherd and taking us out, leading us out to green pastures and quiet waters. But then chapter 3 goes right back to the condemnation, condemnation, condemnation tone. Can somebody read a little bit of chapter 3 for me? Let's go verses 1 through 4.
And I said, hear now, heads of Jacob, and rulers of the house of Israel. Is it not for you to know justice? You who hate good and love evil, tear off their skin from them and their flesh from their bones, and who eat the flesh of my people, strip them of their skin from them, break their bones, and chop them up for the pot, and as meat in the kettle. Then they will cry out to the Lord, but he will not answer them. Instead, he will hide his face from them at that time, because they have practiced evil deeds.
Well, that was mildly uncomfortable. Now, my assumption, and I think it's shared by the commentaries that I consulted at least, my assumption is that he's not talking about literal cannibalism here, but that when you take advantage of people, it is as if you have stripped their skin from them. I mean, if you take a widow who has no way to earn anything, in their culture at least, in this culture, a widow with no way to earn wages, and you take from that widow her clothes and her house and anything else that might support her and help her, you might as well take her skin from her also, because she's going to starve to death. You might as well break her bones at this point. You might as well just eat the flesh off. If you're going to take her clothing and her food and her home from her, you might as well just eat the flesh off of her bones. And so he's using what is clearly very striking, very uncomfortable language to say, like, listen, what you're doing is tantamount to this. I think that should cause all of us to think very, very carefully about the way that we behave toward each other. I think the words that we use in denigrating other people and insulting other people and tearing other people down. I always think about, like, as a parent, my words, the impact that my words might have, tearing down my kids and their self-esteem, tearing them down into things they want to accomplish, the dreams and goals that they have, tearing down their sense of self and personal value and self-esteem. Like, you might as well you might as well chop a leg off if you're going to denigrate them that way. I just think, like, the words we use and the way that we treat other people, maybe it's not cannibalism, but it might as well be for how much it destroys them and tears them down. Very uncomfortable language. What do you guys think about verses 1 through 4? What's your takeaway from that?
They were treating them as if they were not people at all, as if
Yeah.
they were objects, like to be done with as you wish.
Yeah, your cattle to be processed.
We've lost the fact of them being people, and just see them as something you can take advantage of.
Yeah, and I want to be clear, I'm not a vegetarian, okay? Let's be clear about that. Ryan likes himself ribs, okay? But doesn't it take a little bit of a jump, like, when you see a living animal, and you go, now I can just close my eyes and plug my ears, dum, 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 ribs on the plate. Like, there is a step you have to take, right? Because you have to look at an animal and go, all right, this animal is a product. This animal is not a human being. It is a product. It has been born and raised so that it can become meat on my plate, and I am okay with that. I do not have a moral objection to that. But what if you do that to people? In the same way, like John is saying, you have to look at someone as a commodity. You have to look at someone as, this is no longer a human being. This is a commodity that needs to be chopped up and turned into, you take the skin off and I'm going to make leather from the skin, and I'm going to make broth from the bones, and I'm going to prepare the meat in such a way that we can eat the meat. And you look at a human being as nothing but, well, what's your value as a commodity? Is that different from us today? And again, I want to be careful that I don't want to sit here and criticize the very system that I benefit from as someone who is a homeowner with a mortgage and a bank account who uses credit cards, all right? So I'm part of the system I'm criticizing, but is it that different today than a company that looks at people as nothing but commodities, as a credit score, as money to be taken, as a person to be abused and used for their own purposes? Again, I want to be really clear. I'm not saying that it is inherently evil to be, a bank or to loan people money or anything like that, but it does kind of give you some sense of why usury is so condemned in the Old Testament law, why God has such a problem with usury, because it just turns people into commodities. And you might as well just chop them up, like, you might as well be a butcher chopping them up into bits for the way that we treat other human beings in our culture today, just for what their value is in some way. It's very biting. Oops, no pun intended there. But it is very biting there.
Right, and verse 2, you hate good and love evil. You know, Isaiah echoes that in Isaiah 5:20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil.
Great
who put
point.
darkness for light and light for darkness. Who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter.
Yeah.
I think that's important. And I think we're seeing some of that in society today. Certainly, there's evil lifestyles and evil principles that people want us to certainly accept, and then if you try to condemn those, you're in trouble or you're canceled. But this whole flip of evil is good and good is evil has gotten to a level that is unacceptable.
Well, it hits you real suddenly too. Like when you're not expecting it. We flew to Fort Worth this week to go visit Rebecca's sister and family. And on the plane there, we're just kind of getting settled in, getting the kids settled in. And the person sitting behind us overheard us saying May's name. So, May, that's my middle name. What are your kids' other names? She was curious what the kids' all their names were. And we said what their names were. And she was sitting with another woman. And there I go. I had to step in. I said, oh, are you two related? Are you going on a trip together? And said, well, it just so happens that as of 3 days ago, this is my wife. And I wish them safe journeys. That's in the moment, you're there. It's like you're there getting your kids settled on an airplane and it's crowded. It's like in the moment, you're like, hey, can I sit in between you two and have a little Bible study? Like, I don't know if that would have been the appropriate moment for that, but I just in the moment just dodged it and said, well, I hope you two have safe travels. And I do. I don't wish ill travels on anybody, whether they're a lesbian couple or not. I don't wish anybody ill experiences on their travels. So I wish them safe travels, and that was that. But you're right. It's like it just catches you so off guard because if the steward or the stewardess, if the flight attendant knew that they were on their honeymoon, what would the flight attendant do in that moment? They get on the intercom and say, "And we have a newlywed couple. Stand up, Beth and Sierra." Everybody on the plane would do this, right? They'd all, oh, yay, they're on their honeymoon. Because woe to those who call good evil and evil good. You've flipped the script. You've flipped what morality is. And it's so rampant in our culture, and it just catches you so off guard sometimes. It's just there. It's pervasive. It's everywhere you go. Coworkers and neighbors, and it just catches you so off guard sometimes. And maybe we need to do a better job of being prepared in that moment to have the right words to say. And the words failed me. I didn't congratulate them on their wedding, to be clear. I was not congratulating them on their marriage. I wished them safe travels on their honeymoon. But maybe we need to just be a little bit more prepared to have the right words to say in those catch you off guard type moments. Okay, so as we move through the chapter here, he gets back. We just got not much time. Let's go on down to verses 11 and 12 real quick here. Verses 11 and 12, they refused to believe that God would ever abandon them no matter how evil they became. All right, we'll pick that up. Don't worry. We'll go ahead and pick that up on Wednesday night. Thank you so much for all your comments. Appreciate it.
I forgot we were that close in birthday. Good job, Ryan. Thanks. All right.
I don't know what I'm doing first. Literally, I showed up. girl. Getting far. Yeah. So,